Good afternoon. My name is Matthias Risse. I'm the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. I would like to welcome our distinguished speakers and our audience to today's webinar, and to start with a few words about the work of the Carr Center itself. The Carr Center is the hub of the Kennedy School's teaching and research and training in the domain of human rights. And our long-term research priorities include the following three. First of all, there's the Technology and Human Rights Program that we launched a couple of years ago. And that is a program that examines the ethical and the rights implications of technological advancement, and also hosts a fellowship program around these themes. The second is the Renewing Rights and Responsibilities in the United States initiative, which is a systematic assessment of how the United States is doing in terms of realizing human rights in a broad range of domains. And the intention here is also to make recommendations for improvements that are aimed at an administration with a friendly attitude towards human rights. And then thirdly, we have the Nonviolent Action Lab that produces and disseminates knowledge on nonviolent action and how it actually works. But in addition to these three major initiatives, we also are home, the Carr Center is also home to a range of programming relating to other human rights concerns, including corruption, genocide, and torture. In the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd and the ensuing protests, we have also created a more explicit focus on the impact of the pandemic on human rights, on racial justice and equity. In particular, we have been hosting, and we are continuing to host, an ongoing webinar series under the heading of the Struggle for Black Lives, which has been conducted by our executive director, Sushma Raman, the next of which will actually be tomorrow at this very time. So I hope to see many of you again then. We are also offering additional webinars on the nexus now between technology and human rights in the age of the pandemic, which continues very much our series towards Life 3.0 that many of you will be familiar with, which also has been very much on this very nexus. The background now is that we are witnessing an enormous acceleration of the process of digitalization all around us, much of it compulsory digitalization. And we are seeing governments, corporations, and many other actors seize on these new developments to enhance their own reach. And this is often to the detriment of the goals of the human rights movement, which include security and safety, the termination of all forms of discrimination, and emancipated, well-informed political decision-making, always with a focus on those who tend to lose out most in society. So as the human rights movement always is focused on the underdog. Those goals, however, require ongoing struggle to be protected in our changing digital environments, and these matters are among the many issues the pandemic has now rendered overwhelmingly urgent. Today, we welcome three current Carr Center affiliates to this discussion. In July, we will have another webinar on these very topics featuring Princeton University professor Ruha Benjamin, who is the author of Race After Technology. But today, it is my privilege to introduce to you Joan Donovan, Vivek Krishnamurthy, and Bruce Schneier, all of whom, of course, are frequent commentators at this very nexus between technology and human rights. So Joan Donovan is the research director of the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at the Kennedy School. She leads the field in examining online extremism, media manipulation, and disinformation campaigns. So all of these are topics on which, unfortunately, there's a lot of occasion these days for Joan to be in the media. She is published widely in research journals, but also in media outlets, including the NPR, the New York Times, Rolling Stones, The Atlantic, and a number of others. And in addition to her work at the Harvard Kennedy School, Joan also maintains an affiliation with Data and Society. Then Vivek Krishnamurthy is the director of the Samuelson Glushko Canadian Internet Policy and Public Interest Clinic at the University of Ottawa. That is a mouthful for an affiliation, but the thing to know about it is this is Canada's first and only public interest technology law clinic. Vivek's work focuses on the regulatory and human rights related challenges that arise in cyberspace. And along with former colleagues at Harvard's Berkman Klein Center, Vivek is the author of a truly stage-setting study commissioned by Global Affairs Canada that evaluates risks and opportunities for human rights that artificially intelligent systems present. And then last, but of course by far not least, is Bruce Schneier, who is a lecturer at the Kennedy School, internationally renowned security guru. Bruce works at the intersection of security, technology, and human beings. He is a prolific author of about half a dozen books with characteristically interesting titles, the most recent one being Click Here to Kill Everybody, Security and Survival in a Hyper-Connected World. And then also the earlier Data and Goliath, the hidden battles to collect your data and control your world. Bruce regularly writes on security issues on his blog and also in newsletters, and in such ways for a long time has been a known contributor to all things security. So I will now invite each of them to speak for about 10 minutes on some of the issues that have arisen in their specific line of work at this nexus of human rights and technology before the background of these developments in this age of the pandemic. And then after that, we're going to have some discussion among the participants themselves, and then we'll open up, of course, also to your questions, which you should type in the YouTube chat function. So we'll begin with Joan, then turn to Bruce, and then finally to Vivek, so somewhat deviating from the order in which I introduced people now. Joan, over to you. Over to you.
Muted, of course. I always love to kick off a talk by having some technical difficulties. So, and pardon my pandemic haircut, it's been growing out. So yeah, we've been doing a lot of research related to the pandemic, protests, and politics over at the Shorenstein Center, getting ready to put the call out for a series of workshops we're calling Political Pandemonium, that are going to help people understand the terrain of disinformation in this moment and how we see different misinformation campaigns snowball, iterate, get remixed, and then redeployed across new communities. So different ways that we study media manipulation and disinformation, of course, come from our different academic backgrounds. So my team has a bunch of different skill sets, but for the most part, we're digital ethnographers, which means that we pay a lot of attention to what's happening in online worlds, especially communities where lots of people don't study them or they don't want to go there. Lots of misogynist communities, white supremacist communities, racists online. And what we try to learn from those spaces, though, are the tactics they're using to create political polarization, to show up on social media platforms as groups that they're not, how they're trying to hide their motives in the midst of causing chaos or sort of stealing the representational power and the spotlight from other authentic groups or civil society groups. And so we really focus on understanding those tactics because they've evolved rather quickly and rather slowly. It's a very strange world in the sense that if a tactic still works or is still in play on social media, we will see it over and over and over again. And one of the tactics that we tend to study a lot has to do with the generation of fake accounts, imposter accounts, sock puppet accounts that tend to adopt the identity of groups that they are actually trying to attack. So written about this in a few different places and are happy to share some of the links. But one of the things that I was especially taken by and wrote about recently in MIT is the way in which a group of accounts associated with anti-fascist groups on Twitter were outed when the president decided to declare Antifa a terrorist group. Then what you found were these groups that had been calling for violence say, no, we're actually the good guys here. We are Trump supporters and we've been pretending to be Antifa so that we can generate intel. And this is part and parcel of a long series of different ways that we've seen identity become weaponized online. Of course, probably the most canonical and longest standing case has to do with research related to Gamergate and how a bunch of Black feminists, as well as others, were impersonated in order to inflame tensions within these groups of gamers. But more recently, we're seeing a very similar tactic play out where groups are impersonating protesters, they're impersonating Black Lives Matter, and some of it is normal grift. They're just trying to get donations or they're trying to sell you t-shirts. Other factions are much more insidious, and we've been documenting some of them in our newsletter, Meme War Weekly, which Nicole can put the link in the chat to that. Some of the things that we've been also looking at are tactics related specifically to COVID-19 and coronavirus that intersect with technology in some really interesting ways, in the sense that COVID-19 and coronavirus are very unique keywords. And as a result, when people were searching for them, they created an enormous opportunity for media manipulators to create content and wedge these issues. We saw over 100,000 new domains be registered related to COVID-19 and coronavirus. And many of those domains, according to domain companies that we've talked with, are in fact either shops set up to sell you masks and hand sanitizer and all kinds of things that became scarce. And we don't know if they're just sort of credit card fraud, identity fraud type of stores. But a lot of these domains have been put into a sort of quarantine mode by some of these domain servicers. And as we start to try to understand when people search for COVID-19 or coronavirus, what happens, what we would like for them to encounter is timely, local, relevant, and redundant information. And the redundancy is important because you want to see the same information in multiple places so that you can be assured that that information is true and correct. We have a report coming out this week, hopefully tomorrow, by Brandy Collins-Dexter, who is at the racial justice organization Color of Change, called Canaries in the Coal Mine, COVID-19 Misinformation in Black Communities. And in this report, she outlines 4 myths about COVID-19 that were circulating and targeting the Black communities that she was able to research with our team. Namely, some of the myths that people may have encountered but not even know the sources of them related to the myth that Black people can't die of COVID-19. COVID-19 is intended to slow the rising minority majority population, so COVID-19 as a population control tactic. COVID-19 is caused by exposure to 5G technology. In this report, Brandy does an incredible job of dispelling this myth, but then also showing how Black influencers traded this conspiracy theory up the chain until it started to be covered in national media. And what's important, I think, to note about this study and the kind of work that went into it is that Brandy has now been asked to testify tomorrow up in front of Thursday up in front of Congress, related to the ways in which disinformation is targeting different communities at different rates with different kinds of misinformation campaigns. And we're going to continue some of this work with the WHO as we learn more about it and as we find new cases to study. And I'm just going to wrap up by talking a little bit about where we're also looking for disinformation and the tactics specifically that media manipulators and disinformers are using, specifically as it relates to what we call amplifiers, which are technology. One of the things that I think we need to have a more stronger capture on is understanding the relationship between speech and amplification. At this moment, social media platforms are amplifiers. They do not want to touch content. They're doing everything in their power to stay away from moderating in their advertising systems. And we've seen only over the last 6 months or so, they started to relax those guidelines and start to change the way in which advertising is working on their platforms, but we're still seeing massive amounts of misinformation related to how to get tested for COVID-19, what the causes are, and if it is safe to go to the hospital in your area. And those are the things that people are looking for the most. And as a result, there are opportunities for media manipulators. The broader sociological point that frames a lot of our research is that we think about technology as society made durable. It's a Bruno Latour quote, that technology is society made durable. And as we study technology, we want to understand how technology is much more often remixed and repurposed and redeployed more often than it is redesigned. That is, if you redesign technology or invent technology with a very broad coalition of groups, and Sasha Kostanzachuk's new book on design justice really encapsulates this, but if you have a very broad and diverse set of people at the laying the groundwork for a technology as you design it, and you continue to think about technology as something in process and not a product, right? The technology is a process, not a product. And you are in a project of continuous design, then we can iterate, we can change, we can understand what different constituencies need, and we can back away from this idea that technology treats everyone the same and does everything in its power to reduce any harmful divides, which we know the access divide still exists. There are many harmful inequalities that are perpetuated and made worse by technology. And until we start to address the fact that technology both constitutes and is constituted by society, we're going to have a really hard time getting at the questions that related to human rights that Vivek and Bruce will be talking about. Thank you. I think I hit 10 minutes on the nose.
Right. So I've been doing a lot of working on how COVID is affecting security and privacy. I want to talk about some of those now. And by that, I don't mean the fact that we're all working from home on Zoom using unfamiliar technologies and sort of how that is affecting the threat landscape. I want to talk about the actual digital technologies that are being proposed to somehow different ways deal with COVID. And I'm going to talk about 4 of them. The first one, and the one that gets the most press, is contact tracing apps. The idea kind of simply that you have a phone, everyone has a phone, and the phone can somehow magically tell you when you've been exposed to the disease or potentially, and then you can get tested or something. This is something that has been a big push in many countries, and it isn't working. And I want to talk a bit about why and the false promise of tech here. When you think about any kind of app, any kind of system that is trying to authenticate something, you worry about 2 types of errors: false positives and false negatives. The false positive is the app says you've had a contact, you don't have the disease. And that can arise for 3 basic reasons. 1, errors in the technology. So they're using GPS and Bluetooth as ways to figure out proximity. But the error rate is higher than the accuracy we need. Lots of times that it will not register how close you are. It doesn't know about extenuating circumstances. Second problem, it doesn't know if there's a wall. You could spend 8 hours within 1 foot of somebody else, and you could be on opposite sides of a wall, sleeping at a hotel. The apps won't know that. And then you could also have contacts without transmission. And lots of times you can be within the contact distance, and I'll make this up, less than 6 feet, more than 10 minutes, and not get the disease. We're a lot more sophisticated now about how disease spreads. We know about inside versus outside, about airflow, about whether we are facing each other, talking, singing, and that is not captured by the app. So how could that happen? Again, 3 reasons. Right? Location and proximity errors, again, the same problem, not that accurate. Lots of people don't have the app. Even Singapore had only a 20% take rate on using the app. There's going to be a lot of times you're next to somebody, they don't have the app. And lastly, it's transmission without an actual contact. So I assume by now a lot of us have seen the animations of how far a sneeze spreads, or how you can have the pathogens go over partitions. Again, depends on airflow. So, there's a lot about privacy here. Mostly it's been done well. You look at the work Apple and Google are doing, very privacy preserving, but it doesn't pass the efficacy test. I'm going to get back to that in sort of my conclusions. Second thing we hear talked about are immunity passports. And here's the idea that if you have gotten sick or have gotten a vaccine when there is one, you can't spread the disease, and you might need to show an immunity passport to get into a restaurant or a bar or a concert or a stadium. A lot of ways we can do this. It could be as simple as a driver's license. It could be as complex as something you show on your phone. But there are some extraordinary implications of building a have or have not society. And I don't think anybody is talking about whether that makes sense from a rights perspective, whether we want that kind of world. Third thing I hear talked about are some of the trend analyses. And you might see these. There is a Internet of Things thermometer that would collect temperature data. And they were showing hotspots in the United States of where people had more fevers. You had Apple showing usage of Apple Maps to get driving directions. And that was a proxy for how well people are staying put, are socially isolating, are sheltering in place. Done right, there are really no privacy implications. This is aggregate data. But there's a lot to think about before we use that data as a proxy for whatever you're trying to measure. Apple directions mean you have an Apple phone, meaning you're of the demographic that uses Apple and not Android. And if that's not captured in our data analysis, we're going to get very skewed data. And the fourth thing I want to talk about is compliance tracking. You see this in a couple of different ways. You'll see this talked about when someone is entering a country, asked to isolate for 2 weeks, that the phone will regulate whether they're doing that. Think of it like as an ankle monitor you can remove, and then you can imagine how we can get that wrong. The second thing you see this is in workplace. There are companies that are now selling very exacting surveillance technologies, trying to market them to offices as ways to ensure compliance with distancing rules, maximum occupancy rules. So here we have a way that a very invasive surveillance tech can enter into society through this health concern that a company might want to avoid employees getting sick, avoid liability. So those are 4 different technologies. And when we think about all of these, I want to give a framework for how we might want to view them. And that is necessary and proportional. And these are the same framework we look at surveillance technologies. So the first question is it efficacious? Right? Does it actually do well? Contact tracing, no. Immunity passports, maybe. Compliance tracking, probably. And then the question is it proportional? Right? Are there safeguards? What are the privacy safeguards? And I'll give 7 that I look at. Consent. Do people have meaningful consent to whatever it is they're being subjected to? Data minimization. Are we only collecting the data we need for the purpose we need it, for the length of time we need it? Information security. Is the data safeguarded? What are the controls around this data? Privacy by design. Are we building privacy into the applications from the beginning, or is it an afterthought? We do a lot better when we think about privacy from the start. Number 5 is transparency. Is the tech transparent? Do we understand it? Can we evaluate it? Is it open source? Is it closed source? Is it proprietary? Very important. Number 6 is anti-bias. Are there hidden biases in the way the technology is implemented, used, deployed. We see a lot of them around data. But if we want these things to be used and trusted, they need to be good for everybody. And the last is expiration. These are extraordinary times. Remember, my overall principle is necessary and proportional. There are things that might be necessary and proportional now that weren't a year ago and won't be a year from now. So when we build these systems, we need to build them with an eye towards how do they expire? How do we return to normal? How do we stop monitoring people in the workplace? And when we think about those things, I think we're going to build better technologies. So with that, I'll stop and hand it over to Vivek.
Thank you, Bruce and Joan, for setting up this conversation, and to Matthias as well, and the Carr Center for bringing us all together today. I want to take a step back and think about the impact of COVID on human rights generally before thinking about how technology moderates that impact. So the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, called COVID the greatest global crisis since World War II. I'd argue that COVID represents the greatest crisis for human rights, period. This is human rights as we know it emerged after the Second World War, and we've never faced quite a situation like the one we're facing now, with a global disaster, which is mostly a natural disaster in its origins, although made much worse by human actions and negligence. And it's a crisis where very significant limitations on rights are in fact justified. I think it would have been unimaginable on January 1st to contemplate the idea of society-wide lockdowns across much of the world. And yet here we are. And I think that is a legitimate and proportionate response, at least at the first phase of the crisis. But what's unfortunate about COVID is that it's the greatest crisis of human rights that has struck when rights were already in peril. And there's a vast literature about the rights recession and its many causes and its symptoms. So from growing authoritarianism in everywhere from the United States to Hungary to China, to the tools that Bruce mentioned of surveillance that are becoming increasingly pervasive, to everything Joan told us about the ecology of information, misinformation, disinformation in our society, at precisely the same moment as traditional US leadership in the global system, and with regard to human rights in particular, is in freefall, in complete collapse, right? So this is the background against which the experiment we are making with technology as what I would say our best attempt to achieve some kind of normalcy in these weird times is taking place. So thinking about the relationship between technology and human rights during the pandemic, I think Joan and Bruce spoke about the information ecology and also the specific tools that are being used to deal with COVID. I'd like to talk about everything else, right? About our transition to telework, about the replacement of schools with online education, about the mediation of practically all of our social interactions through Zoom or FaceTime or other private platforms for communication, right, that have replaced completely the public square, right? These are all trends that were underway prior to COVID, but COVID has obviously greatly accelerated the uptake and the impacts as well. My concern is that we've had a conversation in recent years about tech-fueled inequality, and now we have tech-fueled inequality on steroids, right? Let's take a few examples. So telework. I'm very fortunate as a university professor to be amongst the people who can do their job to a reasonable degree using telework. But there's an emerging literature that shows just how significant the racial and gender gaps are when it comes to accessibility to doing things remotely. We know that essential workers tend to be disproportionately Black and brown and tend to be female. Those are people who can't do their jobs remotely and often have to do their jobs in person, exposing them to risk of contracting the disease. That is a human rights question right there around equality that engages some of our most fundamental commitments as a society towards treating people equally. Online education, right? Again, I am a fortunate person in that I have the resources to provide my children with access to online tools. But again, the rights of children to education are being very considerably burdened. And it's clear that online education is not a substitute for that. But there's also a huge shifting of what was previously a social burden. We all funded the education system through our taxes to, it's been privatized, right? Individual parents who are differently placed with different means are now bearing that burden on their own, right? And again, that has strong intersectional effects that is disproportionately burdening women and people of color. And I'm just talking about the developed world. In the developing world, all of this is much worse, where pre-existing economic, social, and frankly, digital divides have always been much greater. So consider a society like India, where there are islands of urban privilege against vast rural poverty. And the effects of the measures that have been taken to fight COVID have produced even more extraordinary forms of inequality. I think there's a great regression. We could all take comfort in the fact that there has been this rising tide with regard to economic progress in much of the world, but even that's being lost in the pandemic. So technology is being held out as our best path towards having some sense of normalcy, of normal social interaction, of being able to participate in labor markets, in education, in social and political activities. Yet it is not a great equalizer. It treats people very differently based on elements of their status that are protected and that the human rights system takes into cognizance. So the question then is, what do we do about it? Digitalization is here to stay. I think history shows us that there's going to be no real chance of unraveling technological change in general, let alone going back to the pre-existing status quo. Some of these changes that COVID has introduced in the way we work, the way we interact, the way we organize society are going to prove to be durable, right? So I think it's very good that we've had a robust conversation in these early days about the measures that we are taking and implementing to fight COVID, right? So what are the privacy implications of contact tracing, right? What are the optimal strategies of promoting high quality information about social distancing, for example, as opposed to misinformation and disinformation about the pandemic? As we move forward, however, I think we need to start thinking more about the other kinds of rights that are being impacted by COVID, right? And I think this ties into one of the leading critiques of the human rights movement from within our camp by Samuel Moyn, who is a professor at Yale. And Moyn has very powerfully argued that the human rights movement has not historically paid nearly enough attention to inequality in all of its forms, most especially economic inequality, and to the economic, social, and cultural rights that form part of the legal framework of human rights at the international level. And Moyn powerfully shows that it was inattention to inequality that in many ways set up the rise of authoritarianism that we feel that we are experiencing today. So if we're going to move forward with digitalization, we need to have a really clear focus, again, on these distributive impacts of digital technologies throughout society and between societies on the international plane. I'd also like to put in a plug for Sushma Raman and Bill Schultz's new book, which asks the important question of whether our digital era needs and our new realities require new rights. And one in particular that I've been thinking about is the right to access to digital technologies. For a long time, this was seen as a bit of a fanciful proposition, not core to what human rights are. But if all of society and access to essential government services is now online and it's going to be, I think we need to think very carefully about how we provide minimal access. Now, I'm a business and human rights person. I believe in the role and responsibility of business to respect human rights and to take human rights into consideration in everything that they do. But for me, I truly believe that the duty of the state to protect human rights with regard to both civil and political rights and the progressive realization, in the words of the international treaties, of economic, social, and cultural rights is key. Only the state has the capacity to do what's needed in this moment of crisis, right? The resources, the legislative and economic tools to make things right. So just as our societies are kind of retreating from the idea of human rights, now is actually the moment that we need a new and renewed commitment amongst governments around the world to, again, promoting our most cherished values, and that's across the full spectrum of rights. So I'll leave it there and turn it back to Matthias.
Thank you all. So this was a broad area of material that we see in front of us. One thing that really struck me about all three of your presentations is how much alarming stuff there is going on in the world. Now, of course, you know, this is I guess it comes a little bit with the lay of the land, right? We are human rights people, security people. We are concerned with things that go wrong in the media, online. Also, in a way, we do this. We look for we register the negative stuff for a living, and we try to do something about it. But let me just also see whether, and I'd like to do another shorter round with each of you, just to see. Do you see any silver linings in all these changes that are happening, or the compulsory digitalization that's happening, or the you know, in spite of, or maybe in the responses that people are coming up with by way of dealing with these problems that we are seeing here? Are there silver linings that will add something positive, something worth keeping once we are through the pandemic? Maybe let me just go around in that same order to see whether you have anything on that front. Joan, do you see any silver linings at all?
Yeah, I think that there's some movement in ways that we can learn from the spread of medical misinformation, how and what technology companies are capable of. So for several years of dealing with misinformation, we heard the technology doesn't work that way, or we don't have an idea of what context is, or we can't look at the contents, and now sort of that idea of how the technology works is somehow different, right? And they're like, oh, we can add an interstitial. Oh, we can label these things. Oh, we can downrank information. We can de-index things. We can remove things entirely. And the work that has gone into making sure that certain kinds of I will say explicitly white supremacist organizing, especially on Facebook. They've developed a whole new team for that. And so we are pushing and continue to push with research a way to redesign technology so that we get the technology that we want, not the technology sort of that we're given. So in terms of the silver lining, the other things that we're learning a lot more about is just the many different ways that you can pull off a hoax or a scam using the internet. And cybersecurity researchers definitely have been dealing with this much longer than sociologists, but the team up is necessary at this point to get a sense of, you know, how did we originally root out spam? And is that going to be an appropriate way of rooting out some of these more pernicious misinformation campaigns? The other thing I think that comes to mind is that in times of widespread social disruption, which the pandemic and the protests have introduced, there is many different kinds of imaginations taking hold about what the future could look like. Some of them extremely dystopic and scary and driving people to literally take up arms and build, you know, vigilante mobs in their areas. Other ways, more pro-social ways that we see coming out of these protests, revival of arts and culture, revival of community spaces, revival of broad coalitions, multiracial coalitions for fighting racism. These kinds of groups are going to have explicit recommendations, not just for defunding the police, but for rebuilding social institutions And I think at this stage, when we think about rebuilding social institutions, we also have to think about communication infrastructure. Who's it for? What its purpose is? How can it serve everyone equally? And I'd be remiss not to mention, of course, too, the work that's going into getting a handle on political speech online. We are seeing particular pundits, hesitate to call them journalists, but kinds of journalism that are trafficking in what we may have called clickbait in the past, but because it's being promoted by politicians, now takes on the veneer of disinformation. And I do think that the word disinformation, though, like the word privacy, is not going to be able to carry the day. We're going to have a robust set of concepts that are tied to very specific, both techno and social and comprehensively funded solutions to these problems. And from our perspective, though, you can't split the technical from the social. You can't just go in and fix the technology and say, there, it works fine, moving on. You actually have to understand how people use it, how they deploy it, how it works within their communities, and then what are the threat vectors that openness introduces. And I'll say that I think that one of the ways forward, and I'll wrap on this, is also understanding network harassment in this moment. We're seeing Black activists taking the brunt of troll storms, as well as doxing campaigns that are putting them at serious physical risk. And so we have to be very careful to come up with a strategy for people to be able to get information removed from the internet, especially when it threatens their safety, and to be able to do that quickly. And right now, as I watch these different doxing wars play out, I am horrified at what's to come as the pandemic and the protests continue to create a situation in which we are seeing really hostile and oppositional groups pretend to be the police and use the internet effectively to do that. So I'll end there, which is not exactly a silver lining, other than to say we all have a stake in this.
I think to materially echo what Joan says and maybe even generalize it. What the pandemic is teaching us is that a lot of things that we were told were impossible are actually surprisingly easy, including giving everybody in the country some money. And I think we see that in tech as well. The necessity is the mother of invention, and we are just seeing changes that I think might have taken a decade without the pandemic. And some of those are for the good, and Joan mentioned some of those. I think is increased sophistication in how we're reviewing these technologies. I think there are new ideas of what's possible at all levels of society, and I'm immensely heartened by that. And whether we get there remains to be seen, but this really is a moment where people are rethinking the way they interact with each other, with the government, with corporations, with society. And I think that has enormous potential. Even some of the little bottom-up wins that we've had, that the Google and Apple contact tracing app really is good for privacy. It's surprisingly good. There was a grassroots effort, several of them, to get Zoom to clean up their security and privacy, clean up their encryption, clean up with how they're offering their technologies to paid versus free customers, and they were successful. So here we have a victory that we should celebrate. We need to move on and keep going. But this is causing these sorts of changes. And lastly, I think there is more deliberate thinking in how we design tech. We came into this pandemic with the view that tech companies get to design the systems we rely on for our lives in their near-term financial interest. And while that's still true, there's an increasing realization that maybe that's not the best organizing principle. And we should think of possibly something else. So there's a lot between here and there. I mean, this pandemic fades, and there'll be an enormous push for all of us to go back to where we were, with the only changes to the benefit of the corporations and the governments that are using their technologies. But I think we can go another direction. And I wouldn't say I'm optimistic, but I'm hopeful that in some cases we will. Now I'm hoping Vivek will make me even more optimistic.
I'll give it a shot. No, I really agree with what Bruce and Joan said. I think it's very interesting to see just how fluid things are, right? And again, on the idea that the government would send everyone a check seemed unimaginable 6 months ago, and it's happened, right? I mean, to me, the biggest silver lining, to the extent there is one, is that I think for all of its problems, and the real problems are in digital divides, et cetera, digitalization is promoting access in ways that we couldn't even imagine. Take this webinar. 3 months ago, if we were having a webinar, a gathering of this group, it would have been in person in Cambridge, Massachusetts, right? Now the default is that it's accessible to the world. And I think that's promoting access to information. It's allowing people who have been marginalized, at least in theory, to be able to participate in elite places that were beyond their reach. I think that's great, right? To me, what I really would love to see is if we can take some of these small wins and try to recapture what should have been the promise of tech, right? This was supposed to be something that would promote openness, promote opportunity, equality. That was the promise in the 1990s and the early 2000s, right? And we felt badly for a lot of reasons in the last 10 or 15 years. To me, I think the challenge would be to see if there's a way to recapture that spirit. I mean, this should be an optimistic and future-oriented field, right? That is trying to improve society and increase human dignity, right? Which is at the core of human rights. So I think we have to ask ourselves as a society, what is the kind of society that we want coming out of this? And how do we deliberately get there, both in terms of government policy, but also the role that tech companies play in establishing these central fora for us to interact?
I just want to jump in and say that I don't know if we get there with the technology companies we have in place right now. And especially in terms of the kinds of leadership that they have that have been reticent to understand the role that their technological design plays in exacerbating all of the social inequalities that we've seen, but also adds the capacity, right? It's not just that it does a few things wrong or could fix around the edges. It adds the capacity for surveillance. It adds the capacity for people to act as police. It has turned the field of tech journalism into glorified content moderators, where if you want to get action on something, you've got to get the New York Times to pay attention to it. I mean, if we're gonna go that route, there has to be, and I lived in Canada for several years, so I can say this with a little bit of pride, which is to say there has to be a robust public infrastructure that is supported in a way that understands both the technical and the social components, but has a way to make sure that these companies apply their rules evenly, transparently. And this has an incredibly important cascading effect for how technology is shaped in other countries, with the US-centric focus, meaning that there are going to be governments who are going to use this technology, like we have seen in other places, to foment genocide, to impersonate their political rivals, to drum up, civil unrest. Like, we've seen it time and time again. And I just want to be careful that as we start to think about what the moonshot is, that we don't empower the wrong people who have failed us so many times in the past.
Joan, let me since there were actually a couple of questions on this, on content moderation and other issues about tech companies in the audience question, let me follow up with that. So the one specific question was, what are we in the domain of content moderation? What are we asking of companies? So far, if we are lucky, they are removing a certain kind of content that shouldn't be there, and that's the kind of contribution they are making. And the question from the audience was, should we be asking more of them? Should we be asking companies to assume more responsibility for maybe trying to bring people back together? And I'd like to ask a more general question, first of all, for you, but then maybe also other people want to say something about that. So given the enormous power and importance of the tech companies, which are already substantially bigger than the old energy companies have ever been, what would you like to say to them? How should they see their responsibilities in the human rights domain, as seen from your particular angle?
So there's an excellent paper in one of the law review journals called Rescripting Search by Deidre Mulligan that I often go back to, because the end of the article is basically say that technology companies are information conduits, and we have a right to truth. And so when you Google things like, did the Holocaust happen? You have the right to truth. And for a very long time, if you Googled, did the Holocaust happen? What you got were incredibly anti-Semitic websites that had two things that served the algorithm: fresh and relevant content. And that freshness that was the marker of a website being updated was also something that the algorithm was responding to and making sure that that content stayed at the top because it was considered to be new or fresh. Now, there are places on the internet where that might not matter that much. There are going to be people who go online every single day and say, the earth is flat. I went outside and I looked at the ocean and it's flat to me. And maybe we don't need to care so much about what happens when people Google the earth is flat. But there are key problems in our society related to the way in which we understand human dignity, where we need not just content moderation, but content curation. We need these companies to hire 10,000 librarians and to figure it out and to get in there, understand taxonomies of information. It's not enough to just say, we're gonna put a Google box over here, and if you search for tigers, we're gonna have this picture and the top line of Google, the top line of Wikipedia respond to you on Google. That's not enough. We need a curation strategy that involves librarians and information specialists on very specific subject matter areas where we do need curation. And this might even include journalists and editors who've been at this at a long time. The internet has grown in importance, of course, over the last few decades. And right now, as everybody is isolated, at home, searching for information, COVID-19 was a powder keg. Anytime you get high attention to a topic and you have low content, what you get is media manipulation. You get an opportunity to distort what is out there. If you go to things like covid19.com and things like that, for a while they were just up for sale for an egregious amount of money. Because they knew that key word was valuable. And so I think our responsibility is to push for content curation, not just content moderation, on very specific subject matter areas that are, as Renee DiResta has put it, your money or your life. And I think that that's something we need to do now.
I want to be more general. That we really built a technology industry where tech companies can design the world as they saw fit. And we did it because fundamentally it didn't matter. It didn't matter how the social network was built or what algorithms were used or how the systems worked. And now it does. And I actually don't blame the companies. Their job is short-term financial gain. That's what they're for. That if we expect them to have other considerations, whether it's rights and liberties and other societal rules, we as society need to impose them. I think what's missing is government, who is afraid to regulate these technologies because they are enormous cash cows. But we are past the world where these are tech toys. And when we're building technologies, we're building the world. And as I said before, putting those in the hands of a bunch of companies who are interested in their short-term financial gain is not the way to do it. So we need to constrain them in many ways. I mean, content is just one of them, but it is no longer okay to create the future in this manner. It is too important, it is too relevant, it is too critical to all of us in so many ways.
Yeah, I'd like to echo what Joan and Bruce have said. I think we have seen a failure of governance in tech by tech companies, right? And it's an internal failure of governance that's in part the structures by which corporations operate, especially in the United States, and the abdication of government responsibilities. And what's really troubling about that is, again, if we believe in the idea of a democracy where people have some kind of basic equality and some basic entitlements by virtue of citizenship, the concentrations of power that come with being able to control technology platforms and to design them for private motives is really quite, it's a major problem. You know, we've come very far in the history of corporations from a time when corporations had to have public purposes and had to be specifically chartered to this idea of shareholder capitalism, right? Where corporations are supposed to maximize profit for their shareholders for the next quarter. What I do hope is that the conversation we're having, not just about tech regulation, but coming out of COVID, is going to lead to a redefinition of some of these social roles for businesses writ large, right? That's happened the last 15 years with the idea of business and human rights to an extent, but I think we have a lot further to go on that.
Okay, thank you. Let us turn to another question from the audience. One question from the audience is if any of you can think of and name any examples of other countries, perhaps, where technology has been put to good use by way of fighting COVID-19. Are there positive examples of that?
I can, you know, so there was right at the beginning, once we, you know, collectively as a society decided that this was a serious issue, we did see technology companies step in and say they were going to serve authoritative content, right? And that this was going to go up on any search that was for these very specific keywords. And again, I'm going to do the thing I always do where I'm like, yeah, like they did this, but then there was this huge gap that we didn't realize was happening, which was that different groups were calling COVID-19 other things, right? So we had racist and pejorative ways in which people were saying this stuff. And the president, you know, just the other night said one of these terms. That kind of keyword in particular leads people in a very specific kind of rabbit hole online of white identity extremists, as well as others that predating America, the US anyway, paying attention to the pandemic had already been using anti-Asian slang words to identify coronavirus. So quickly, when you look at this set of keywords that I'm not going to repeat here, you go directly to that content without any interstitial, without any you know, link to the CDC, for instance, or link to the WHO, which is what the platform companies are calling. And then you had a bunch of grifters enter into the space trying to sell you anything and everything. And instead of using COVID-19 or coronavirus, they would just say the virus, right? And those for a long time weren't being caught by different platform companies. So as people were searching for things like toilet paper, which became incredibly scarce, we saw very similar problems with trying to get the right information to the right people at the right time. And so I wrote a short article on MIT Tech Review saying, you know, you've already built advertising infrastructure. Why don't you redeploy it so that it does what it needs to do, which is look demographically at who is getting what information about COVID-19 and coronavirus, and then make sure they get the correct information, not just when they search, but also as part of their normal browsing behavior, that they would see updates for COVID-19. And then Twitter did one step further. It made when you search under the little magnifying glass, you do get COVID-19 as its own set word. The other thing, though, that was problematic is different communities were using the term Rona, or shorthand for coronavirus. And again, they too were left out of information that they might need to get. The other problem that repurposing the advertising infrastructure would help us solve is the local piece of this, which is that people are searching for local information related to if their hospital is open, how to get tested, where to get tested. And right now, depending on where you are, there are enormous information deserts that are, where people are searching for this crucial information and they cannot find it anywhere. And so another thing that we have to think about as we think about technology and not just the internet is, what is the role of radio? What is the role of television, especially local TV networks, in providing timely, local, relevant, and redundant information so that people can get service when they need it?
And very quickly, I think the technologies we look at the successes are the biomedical technologies. This is fundamentally a health concern. When I say, like, who's doing the great work, it's the amazing work that's happening in vaccines, in actual manual contact tracing, and all the medical information we have now that we didn't have 3 months ago. So, I mean, I think as an information technology, kind of doing pretty poorly. But as a species in our current state of technology, I mean, the success is going to be in all of those biology and medicine and those areas.
So let's move on to another question. A couple of people were picking up on, Bruce, your comments actually on immunity passports. That, by the way, is a topic that we have discussed at the Carr Center a few weeks ago also. So basically what happened was we got a request to do some thinking about immunity passports, and the particular context there was the UK. In the UK, they are very urgently and immediately thinking about introducing such documents. And so the two Carr Center fellows, Mark Latonero and Elizabeth Renieris, and I, the three of us, wrote short essays on that. And we all came to pretty negative assessments about that, really echoing things that you said, and things that stood out to my mind. There was, I mean, if you have things like that, the most important thing is, as you said, Bruce, you are introducing a new kind of advantage, disadvantage dimension into society, right? And that is always, comes with lots of possibilities of abuse. Then particular things for this dimension is you are creating sort of weird incentives for people, right? People who are desperate to get this passport for whatever it does for them, and then artificially are trying to become sick, which is not helping the problem. And then one other thing also to mention is that you can give an immunity passport only to somebody who has been tested, but that doesn't mean you are giving it to all the people who should actually have it, right? And there's going to be a sequencing problem. And so you will be, whatever advantage it generates, you will exclude people from it for the wrong sort of reason, right? So we three of us really came for related reasons, came to a very negative assessment. And then something quite interesting happened. So basically the party who had asked us for an assessment then came back to us and said, well, so we understand you don't like this. We understand you are worried from a human rights point of view, but what if this is happening anyway? What if we are introducing them? This is also one of the questions that came. So if we have them, how do we make sure that people are not precluded from things they should have? And so then we basically decided we don't want to go there. We were worried about a form of corporate capture there also. We just wanted to be seen as saying, no, we should not go down this route. But Bruce, would you be willing to go down that route? So if we, if the UK said to you, if you got a phone call from Boris Johnson and said, we're going to do this, Bruce, but we need to know from you, given that we do this, what should we be paying attention to? Or would you, maybe you would also just want to say, the only thing I want to be on record for here is that you shouldn't do this. But would you or other people on the panel, would you say something else?
So I think you want to look at the other privileged document that we all use, and that is our right to go into a bar and get alcohol. That's our driver's license. Many of us have this in our pocket, and it is a credential of the magnitude of an immunity passport. And as we all know, it is regularly forged, it is regularly cheated on, because getting access to alcohol is something that any 18-year-old wants. So we're going to have to build in an enormous amount of security, even leaving aside people who are going to deliberately get themselves sick in order to have the credential allows them to get the document, but actually faking the document. So, I would look at that, and my lesson from driver's licenses and teenagers, that this is very hard. That when the privilege is desirable, there's an enormous amount of resources going into to hack the credential. And then you have to look at everything in your chain. How do you make sure that, again, false positives, false negatives. I want to ensure that nobody who doesn't deserve it has one, but also that everyone who does deserve it gets one. And there's an enormous number of things that you brought up. And building this is not easy. When you think that, oh yeah, you spend a week, you have a website, you have an app, and suddenly you get something on your phone, you show it to some bouncer at a club. And it's not the way it's going to work. These are complex computer infrastructure systems that could take a year to build. And you could build it lousy and have all the problems, or you can build it right and it might be too late. But it might be that you actually can't do it. But those are the things you want to start thinking about well before you design how it actually works.
Next.
Yeah, building on some of the technical considerations, I do think we need to, as a society, to have that debate about whether we create a new status, right, of immunity. Because leaving aside immunity from exposure, and I'm not a biomedical scientist, if and when a vaccine is available and vaccination becomes the requirement to participate more fully in society, we're going to have a similar set of problems around documentation. And also just a question about do we want to treat people differently based on whether or not they've been vaccinated, right? So those are questions we grapple with today at a lesser scale. I think the scope and scale of the question is going to become very pressing. So we should start thinking about it now in a very serious way.
And we have some of this today. I have a little yellow document I carry with me when I used to fly abroad. And there were countries that could, if they wanted, ask to see my yellow fever vaccination and deny me entry if I didn't have one. Now, that never actually happened, but that's possible. So we have some of this, but never to this magnitude.
Okay, thank you. So it's time for us to conclude. So I'd like to do one more round. So a lot of people who are watching these webinars they're watching them as concerned citizens. They're seeing a lot of things happening around them. Many people right now feel like they're losing control over a lot of things that are happening in their lives, and they're wondering, what should I do? What can I do? What should I be paying attention to? What does citizenship involve these days? So what does citizenship involve by way of keeping an eye on what governments do with technology, what corporations do with technology? So as a way of concluding, I want to go around one more time, and then starting with Joan again. So what is it that you want to say to the concerned citizen? What is it that what are the things that the concerned citizen should keep on their radar and should be bringing to the attention of their parliamentarians? And so what is it that you would say to them by way of concluding this discussion?
Great. I just wanted to say thank you to the Carr Center for having me. I know I've been a little combative. I get pretty amped up sometimes when I'm dealing with these issues, and part of it has to do with the fact that I've been studying internet and communication technologies for over a decade now, and the kinds of work that we're doing has changed dramatically, especially in critical internet studies. And so I'm hoping that scholars in this area continue to push the envelope of research, to do daring things, to engage with communities who are trying things that are different, things that might fail. I think it's really important for us to think about what failure means and try, fail, try again. As we think about this moment in terms of the pandemic, the Black Lives Matter protests, and the politics, we didn't really get into too much about election integrity and what we're seeing around disinformation related to the voting process, at least in the US. And so going forward, people should know that we are trying to understand these misinformation narratives as they arise and doing our best to get the information out there quickly. So when you are, though, just an ordinary run-of-the-mill type folk that isn't getting a call from Newsweek for your opinion, you can also just become a trusted information source to your social networks, right? Know where people can get tested in your area, share that information. You can go to your local city and government websites, .gov for up-to-date statistics, visit the Johns Hopkins University websites. They have really great explainers, but just become the person that people know they can rely on to know what's happening on the ground in your area, and avoid sharing things that seem outlandish, crazy. I've never heard of that before. Some of the characteristics that Deb Roy's team over at MIT have shown related to fake news is that it spreads because it's novel and it's outrageous, right? And so the moment you see or feel yourself reacting to a story and it's novel and it's outrageous, try to do a little digging, try to see if it's real, try to figure out where it's coming from. And there are a bunch of different tip sheets that First Draft News has put out that I highly recommend. But in the long run, I think, the less we spend our attention and our time on debating misinformation and the more time we spend just making sure that we are serving truth and, being an advocate for the truth in our community, the better off we're all going to be in terms of getting through at least this pandemic. But racism is going to be here for the long haul, and we do have to develop strategies on how to become an anti-racist and to follow the work of Dr. Kendi on that, as well as to read, discuss, interpret, and act within your power. I think is what I try to do every day, and I hope that other people can follow that.
So very quickly, get involved in politics, make these political issues. And we're seeing that right now. I live in Minnesota. Our police reform bill stalled in the State House because the parties couldn't agree. It's happening the same thing's going to happen in Congress. If these are not political issues, then a lot of change does not happen. We can protest, we can have seminars and meetings and ideas, but these need to be political issues at all levels, national, state, local. And when they are, and when we vote based on them, when they're discussed in presidential debates, that's when we get real change. And it has frustrated me for the past couple of decades that these are never political issues, and we need to change that. And we can do that by making them political issues.
Completely agree with that. I think a lesson of recent weeks is don't settle, engage and fight back. And I think the success of Black Lives Matter shows that what change can happen even in the midst of a crisis. And for me, I think the idea that individuals should bear the costs of this alone, that we should be forced to adapt and be resilient without social support is really anathema. And I think people should fight that. We're in this together as a society, and we need to change the society to deal with our new reality.
Hey, thank you, Joan. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Vivek. Thank you to the audience for sticking with us. I hope to see many members of the audience again for future Carr Center events, including our next webinar tomorrow on the struggle for Black lives. And I hope that you will all stay safe and help others to stay safe, and that we will be able to implement some of these terrific ideas that we have discussed here today, so to bring real change to the domain of the political rather than just having webinars about it. Thank you all, and a good day to you.
Thank you.